The whole room laughed at once. Not the polite kind of laughter, not the nervous kind either. The full, open-mouthed kind that fills a barn and bounces off corrugated metal walls and makes a person feel very small, very fast. The auctioneer had barely finished reading the lot number before people were already turning to each other, nudging elbows, shaking their heads. And at the center of all of it stood a 20-year-old named Kofi Mensah-Reid, holding $40 in crumpled bills, staring at a water-damaged wooden trunk that hadn't been opened in 19 years. He didn't flinch. That was the thing nobody who was there that day would ever quite admit, that the kid didn't flinch. The Millhaven County Estate Auction happened every spring at the old Belmont Fairgrounds, just east of town on the highway that cuts through the valley before the land flattens out into farmland. It was the kind of event people drove 40 minutes to attend, not because they needed anything, but because in a town of 4,000 people it was something to do. Farmers came. Retired couples came. The kind of collectors who wore vests with too many pockets came. And they all knew each other, which was the part that mattered. Kofi did not quite belong to that world. He had moved to Millhaven 3 years earlier with his mother, a Diaz, after his father passed. They had come from Hamilton, which people in Millhaven said like it explained something. He worked mornings at the Co-op hardware store on Fletcher Street, and evenings he spent in the small garage behind their rented house, restoring furniture, chairs mostly, sometimes cabinets, occasionally things people would describe as hopeless cases. He had a gift for it. Anyone who'd seen his work knew that. But Millhaven was a town where who you were mattered more than what you could do, and Kofi had not yet earned the first to get credit for the second. The trunk in question was Lot 47. It had come from the estate of a man named Raymond Culver, who had died in February at 81, leaving behind a farmhouse full of things his 3 adult children wanted nothing to do with. The estate lawyer, a compact man named Gerald Foss, had organized the auction. Most of the lots moved quickly. The John Deere tractor, the chest freezer, the dining set from the 1970s that somebody's wife would sand and repaint and call farmhouse chic. But Lot 47 had sat on its own folding table near the east wall, draped in a cloth that someone had removed before the auction started, and from the moment it was uncovered, people had kept their distance. It was a steamer trunk. Dark wood, leather straps, brass fittings gone green. Water stains bloomed across the top in rings, the way wood looks after it's been wet and dried and wet again over many years. The lid was warped slightly at one corner. The brass latch had been replaced at some point with a padlock, an older one, the kind with a brass body and a steel shackle, and that padlock had not been opened in 19 years because nobody alive knew the combination, and Raymond Culver had taken whatever he knew about it to the frozen ground of Calvary Cemetery on the 4th of February. The Culver children had tried to get it open. Raymond's daughter, Sandra Culver Marsh, had told Gerald Foss that her brother had spent 20 minutes on it with bolt cutters the previous fall and given up. The metal was harder than it looked, she said. They'd considered cutting the trunk itself open, but something about it had made them stop. It felt wrong somehow, like opening a letter addressed to someone else. So it sat. When the auctioneer, a florid man named Terry Galvin, called Lot 47, the mood in the room shifted slightly. The particular shift that happens when something nobody wants gets called anyway. Terry described it efficiently. Steamer trunk, unknown contents, sold as is. Starting bid, $25. Silence. $25 for this fine antique trunk, Terry said, in the tone of a man who had long since made peace with the absurdity of his profession. Solid construction. History. History of sitting in a barn. Someone said from the third row, and the room laughed. 25, Terry repeated. Kofi raised his hand. The laughter started quietly. Just a few people, the ones sitting close enough to see clearly who had bid. Then it spread as people leaned to look or turned or craned their necks. He was standing near the back, near the east wall, close to the trunk itself. He was wearing a gray work shirt with the Co-op logo on the chest. He was the youngest person in the room by at least a decade, and he was the only black person in the room, period, which is a detail that matters because it was the detail everyone noticed first, whether they would say so or not. "25 from the young man in the back," Terry said, professionally neutral. "30, said a heavy-set man near the front, Don Hadley, who bought things at auction the way some people swat flies, reflexively, just to be doing something. "35, Kofi said. Don Hadley turned around. He took a long look at Kofi. Then he looked at the trunk. Then he looked back at Kofi with an expression that people use when they're trying to work out if someone is stupid or if they're missing something. 40, Hadley said. 50. The murmuring started at 50. People were paying attention now. "What's he think is in there?" a woman near the middle whispered, not quietly enough. "Couldn't tell you," the man next to her said. "Boy doesn't know the town, doesn't know Raymond." That was the line that would get repeated later in kitchens and at the counter of the diner on Main Street and in the parking lot of the co-op. Doesn't know Raymond. As if knowing Raymond Culver was a prerequisite for bidding on his belongings. As if there were rules that needed to be followed and Kofi Mensah-Reid had missed the part where they were explained to him. Don Hadley shrugged and sat back. He was done. $50 to the young man in the back, Terry Galvin said. Going once. Going twice. The gavel came down. And the room laughed again. Harder this time, less polite. The laughter of people who had decided that they understood something. That a young outsider had paid $50 for a locked trunk full of nothing. That it would serve as a small lesson. That the world had corrected itself briefly and everything was in order. Kofi paid Gerald Foss in cash, folded from his wallet, and arranged to collect the trunk at the end of the auction. He didn't make eye contact with anyone on the way out. He loaded the trunk into the bed of his pickup with the help of a teenager Gerald had hired for the day, because the trunk weighed more than it should have. Considerably more, and that fact stuck in Kofi's mind as he drove home on the highway with the windows down and the radio off, thinking. He had not bid on that trunk because he was impulsive. He was not, by nature, an impulsive person. His mother would have been the first to tell you that. He had bid on it because of his father. Noel Mensah-Reid had been a locksmith, not a hobby locksmith, not an occasional locksmith, a professional one, trained, certified, one of those men who could sit down across from a lock and understand it the way a doctor understands a patient. He had run a small shop in Hamilton for 11 years, and Kofi had grown up in the back of that shop, doing homework on a workbench, listening to his father talk to locks under his breath, watching his father's hands move, with a precision that seemed to belong to a different, quieter world than the one outside the shop window. Noel had died of a cardiac event on a Tuesday afternoon in November 17 months ago at 53 years old. He had been at work. He was alone. Kofi had inherited almost nothing material from his father. The shop had debts, the equipment went to cover them, and the lease was gone inside a month. But he had inherited his father's eyes, and his father's hands, and his father's particular way of looking at a locked thing and knowing, without being able to fully explain how, whether there was something worth opening it for. The padlock on Raymond Culver's trunk was a Corbin Bohannon Model 7, circa 1960s, a combination lock with a 4-digit dial and an internal mechanism that his father had once described to him as a small and honest piece of engineering. Kofi had recognized it the moment he saw it, had felt the recognition like a small warm pressure in the back of his chest, the way you feel when you hear a song you haven't thought of in years. His father had worked on 3 of them in Kofi's memory. He had explained, once, sitting on a stool with a disassembled lock spread across a cloth, that this model had a manufacturing quirk, a slight resistance in the dial at certain digit positions that, if you knew what to listen for, could tell you which numbers were live. Not tell you the combination, but narrow the possibilities, give you a starting place. A lock like this, Noel had said, spinning the dial slowly with 2 fingers, talks if you know how to listen. Kofi had been 12 years old. He had never forgotten it. He drove home with that weight in the truck bed and his father's voice in his memory. And by the time he pulled into the gravel beside the garage, he had already decided to take the rest of the day. The garage was small, barely enough room for a vehicle and a workbench, but Kofi had organized it with the kind of careful attention that people develop when they grow up without a lot of space. Tools hung on pegboard in size order. Supplies were labeled. The workbench was clean. He slid the trunk off the tailgate and onto a furniture dolly, rolled it inside, positioned it under the light, and stood looking at it for a long time. Up close, in good light, it told a different story than it had on the folding table at the fairgrounds. The water damage was old, 15, 20 years at least, possibly older. But beneath the staining, the wood was Baltic birch, solid construction. The joints dovetailed by hand. The leather straps were original, the brass fittings were original, and whoever had packed and closed this trunk had done it with intention. The padlock had been placed on the exterior latch, not the original hardware, meaning someone had added it after the fact deliberately to keep it shut. Kofi crouched in front of the lock and turned the dial once, slowly, the way his father had shown him. He felt it on the third number. A small thing, a whisper of resistance, a catch in the mechanism that lasted less than a quarter turn. He noted it. He went back to 0 and tried again. He worked for a long time. Not frantically, he was not a frantic person. He worked methodically, the way his father had worked, talking to the thing under his breath, listening to the answers. He took breaks, he drank tea, he came back. He tried combinations that the resistance suggested. He eliminated, he refined. At 11:40 in the evening, the padlock opened. He held it in his hand for a moment. It was lighter without tension. He set it on the bench. He put both hands on the trunk lid and looked at it. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet. A dog somewhere a few streets over, the distant sound of a train on the CN line north of town. He lifted the lid. The smell hit him first. Cedar and something older, something papery and dry. The smell of things that have been sealed away from air for a long time. He blinked. The trunk was packed. Not carelessly, methodically, the way someone packs who intends what they're doing, who has thought about it. On top, folded carefully, were 2 wool blankets, gray military surplus style. Beneath those, wrapped in old newspaper, were half a dozen items, ceramic pieces, he thought, or glass. He didn't disturb them yet, but it was what was in the upper tray. A shallow, removable tray he found by feeling along the inside edge of the lid that made him sit back on his heels. A letter. And beneath the letter, a manila envelope, fat and sealed with packing tape that had yellowed to amber. He picked up the letter first. The envelope was unsealed, the flap simply tucked. He opened it and unfolded 2 pages of handwriting. Careful, deliberate handwriting in blue ink, the handwriting of a person who had learned penmanship in school and took it seriously. The letter was dated September 2004. It was addressed to no one specific. It began, "If you are reading this, then I have either gone or given up trying to fix it myself, and in either case I am sorry." Kofi read the letter once quickly. Then he read it again, slowly. Raymond Culver, the letter explained, had been the facilities manager at Millhaven County General Hospital from 1987 to 2001. In the summer of 1999, he had discovered, in the course of routine inventory, that surgical supply invoices had been falsified. Not in a small way, not in a careless way, but systematically over a period of years, to the tune of what he estimated at the time as several $100,000. He had documented what he found. He had brought it to his department head, a man named Patrick Holt. He had been told to let it go. He had not let it go. He had brought it to the hospital administrator. He had been told more firmly to let it go. He had not let it go. In February 2000, Raymond Culver had been let go instead. Laid off in a restructuring, they said, which everyone understood and nobody said out loud. He had kept the documentation. Every invoice, every comparison figure, every note he had made. All of it was in the manila envelope in the tray inside the trunk. He had kept it because he had believed in 2000. And again in 2001, when he'd tried once more to raise the issue through a provincial health authority contact. And again in 2004, when he'd written this letter, that someone would eventually care enough to do something with it. That the right person would come along. What he had not anticipated, Raymond wrote near the bottom of the second page, was that he would run out of time before that happened. That the years would move the way they do and the energy required to keep fighting would become, finally, more than he had. "I should have done more," the letter said. "I know that. But I couldn't open this box myself anymore. Maybe someone else can." The trunk, Kofi understood, had been packed in 2004. It had sat in Raymond Culver's barn for 19 years. Raymond had died in February. His children, who had not known what was in it and had not been told, had taken one look at the lock and sent it to the auction. And Kofi Mensah-Reid, who had grown up in the back of his father's locksmith shop in Hamilton, who had paid $50 on instinct and been laughed at by a roomful of people who didn't know him, had opened it on a Tuesday night in a garage on Birch Crescent, Millhaven, Ontario, and read the letter Raymond Culver had sealed away in the hope that it would one day find the right hands. He sat on the cold concrete floor for a long time. The dog down the street had gone quiet. The train was gone. It was almost 1 in the morning. He read the letter a third time. He did not go to the police immediately. He thought about it, turned it over, the way he turned problems over, patient and methodical. The concern was simple. A 20-year-old with $50 worth of claim to a dead man's trunk walking into a police station with 25-year-old hospital invoice records was not, on its face, a situation that commanded immediate respect. He understood how rooms worked. He had been in enough rooms to know that the first thing people assess is whether you belong in them. He called his mother first. Adeza Mensah-Reid listened without interrupting, which was her gift. She could listen the way other people pray, completely and without distraction. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Your father would have known what to do," she said. "I know," Kofi said. "So do you." He called a woman named Judith Osei, who had been 2 years ahead of him at school in Hamilton and now worked as a legal aid paralegal in Guelph. She picked up on the 4th ring, which was better than he'd expected at 1:15 in the morning. He told her what he'd found. She listened. She asked 3 questions, sharp and specific. Then she said, "Don't touch the documents more than you have to. Photograph everything before you move it. And call me in the morning. I know someone at the health ministry." He spent the next 2 hours doing exactly that. He photographed every page with his phone, the lamp positioned for maximum clarity. He laid each document flat on the workbench before he touched it, handled them only by the edges. He was precise. His father had always said that the way you do a thing tells the thing how seriously you mean it. By 3 in the morning, he had sent a complete set of photographs to Judith and placed the original documents carefully back in the envelope. He locked the garage. He went inside. He did not sleep particularly well, but he slept. What followed was not simple and was not fast, because these things never are. The health ministry contact Judith knew was a woman named Harriet Boateng, an auditor in the provincial compliance office, who looked at the photographs and said she would need to see the originals before she could say anything definitive, but that what she was looking at appeared to be, and she chose her words carefully, potentially significant. The originals were examined. Authentication took time. Document experts, paper analysis, chain of custody considerations. Patrick Holt, who had been Raymond Culver's department head and who had told Raymond to let it go in 1999, had retired in 2006 and now lived in Barrie. He was 74. He was contacted. He did not at first say anything useful. The hospital administrator from that era had died in 2015. 3 members of the procurement chain Raymond had documented were still alive and still in the province. Kofi did not attend any of these meetings or interviews. He was not entitled to. The documents were evidence in a process that did not technically belong to him, whatever he had paid for the trunk. Judith kept him updated, calling from the parking lot after meetings with the language of someone who had learned to say things carefully. "Progress is being made. The right people are paying attention now. This isn't going to go away." In Millhaven, word had spread about the trunk, the way word spreads in small towns, imprecise and fast like water through cracked ground. The story that circulated was garbled in the way these stories always are, missing most of the actual facts and substituting assumptions, but the shape of it was clear. The young man from Hamilton had bought something at the Culver auction that turned out to matter. Nobody quite said they'd been wrong to laugh, but the laughter was very quiet now. Don Hadley stopped into the co-op one afternoon, stood at the counter where Kofi was logging an inventory order, and said without quite looking at him, "Heard you made a good buy at the Culver sale." "I'm not sure yet," Kofi said. Hadley nodded slowly. like that was a satisfying answer, and left. Sandra Culver Marsh called him on a Thursday in early June. Her voice was careful, the way voices get when people are feeling something they haven't decided how to name yet. She said her brother had told her some of what was happening. She said her father had never talked about why he'd left the hospital, and that they had always assumed it was simply age, simply time, simply the ordinary drift of things. She said she didn't know what to seize exactly, but that she was glad the trunk had found someone who could open it. Your father left it hoping someone would, Kofi said. Sandra was quiet for a moment. He was a stubborn man, she said. He believed that things got righted eventually, even if he didn't live to see it. She paused. I used to think that was naive. And now? Kofi asked. She didn't answer right away. I don't know yet, she said. Ask me again in a year. The formal findings came down in October. A provincial compliance review concluded that systematic procurement fraud had occurred at Millhaven County General between 1996 and 2001. The total figure was significantly higher than Raymond Culver had estimated, closer to $1.2 million over the full period. 3 individuals were referred to the appropriate authorities. The hospital's current administration, which bore no connection to the events in question, issued a formal statement acknowledging what had occurred and what Raymond Culver had done in attempting to stop it. The statement mentioned him by name. It said that his concerns, had they been properly addressed at the time, could have prevented years of ongoing loss to a public institution. Nobody threw a party. That was not how these things worked. There was no ceremony. Raymond Culver was not given anything posthumously, because the systems that produced formal acknowledgments had not been designed with people like Raymond Culver in mind. But his name was in the public record now, attached to the right story, for the first time in 23 years. And Sandra Culver Marsh, when she read the statement, called her siblings and read it to them over the phone, and then sat at her kitchen table for a long time by herself. Kofi heard about the findings from Judith, who called on a Friday afternoon. He was in the garage, sanding a rocking chair someone had brought him the week before, and he had to step outside to hear her properly. He stood in the gravel with sawdust on his hands while she told him. That's it, he said. That's it, she said. That's what it looks like. The rest takes more time. He looked down at his hands, at the sawdust, at the grain still visible in it if you looked closely. Okay, he said. You did a good thing, Judith said. He thought about his father, about a stool in a locksmith shop in Hamilton, a disassembled lock spread on a cloth, 2 fingers on a dial. A lock like this talks if you know how to listen. My father did, Kofi said. The trunk sits in the corner of Kofi's garage now, cleaned up, the leather straps reconditioned, the brass fittings polished back to something close to what they were. He did not sell it. He wasn't sure why, exactly, except that it felt like the wrong thing to do. Sandra Culver Marsh came to see it in November, on a cold afternoon when the maples on Birch Crescent had gone bare and the sky was the flat white of early winter. She stood in the garage doorway and looked at it for a while. It's smaller than I remembered, she said. It always is, Kofi said, when you finally look at the thing. She nodded. She didn't say much else. She stayed for tea and they talked about Raymond, not about the hospital, not about the fraud, but about the man himself. He had coached minor hockey for 20 years. He had made his own jam. He had believed, stubbornly, right to the end, that the world was capable of getting things right if you gave it enough time. She left before dark. Kofi stood at the window and watched her taillights disappear around the corner. Then he went back to the rocking chair. There is something worth saying here, before this ends. Something that the story itself won't say because stories don't say things. People do, and someone has to. A roomful of people laughed at a young man for paying $50 on instinct, for trusting something he couldn't fully explain, for refusing to be the person the room had already decided he was. And they were wrong. Not because he turned out to be right about the trunk, but because that was never the point. The point is that nobody in that room asked what he knew that they didn't. Nobody considered that the thing they were laughing at might be something they simply couldn't see. A man named Raymond Culver spent 23 years waiting for the right person to come along. He never got to know that they had. That is the part that stays with you, if you let it. Kofi Mensah-Reid listened to a lock the way his father taught him. He paid attention to the small, honest resistance that told him where the truth was hiding. He was patient with it. He did not give up when the mechanism was stubborn, or the hour was late, or the room full of people had already made up its mind. His father would have understood exactly what that meant. Maybe, if you are reading this, you do too.